Over the last couple of years, we've seen quite a number of reports, especially that I can recall of, that have been pointing to the problem of inequality in South Africa. It seems to be growing. The situation does not seem to get better. What are the driving factors behind this?
Well, I think part of the driving factors obviously is a legacy of apartheid. I think that's always a starting point. Due to the, mass dispossession of black people, primarily, that's why we're sort of the most affected by inequality. But I think in the last 5 or 10 years or so, particularly under the leadership of former President Jacob Zuma, we've seen quite depressed growth coming from the previous period of Thabo Mbeki. But I think the Thabo Mbeki period in itself, despite being a high growth period, led to increasing inequality because it was jobless growth. What was always termed as jobless growth, as a result, led to rising in unemployment, despite the fact that we had high growth. But then in the Jacob Zuma era, we've seen depressed growth, and in fact over the last 3 or 5 years or so, we've seen growth almost grinding to a complete halt. And I think last year was primarily saved as a result of rising business confidence and the change in political leadership in the ANC, which resolved a lot of the political uncertainty ahead of the 2019 elections, which was curtailing growth, because what this means to investors is that there's a lot of policy uncertainty. There was also uncertainty as a result of reshuffling of ministers, and so they don't have a quite predictable business environment, which makes them sluggish to invest. And as a result, they create less jobs, and this is the main driver behind the high inequality. As a result of high unemployment, people don't have incomes, which is also part of the thing that keeps them in the poverty cycle.
The bulk of this burden is really being borne by black South Africans. And when we look at the kind of skills that are then being put into the economy and what the economy needs in order to create sustainable employment, talk to me about some of the gaps that exist within that need, that demand, and actually what is supplied.
Sure. So you've heard a lot about the STEM skills, the science, technology, engineering, and mathematical type of skills. And I think despite the shortage we currently have, there's been quite a strong, push and enrollment in students in these areas, such as engineering and the sciences. But where South Africa has a huge gap is around apprenticeship type of skills, or vocational skills, and that's as a result of a strong emphasis on university education, which churns out bachelor's degrees and the scientific masters and postgraduate degrees, but doesn't provide the skills that are needed for the mechanic on the side of the road, plumbing skills, etc. Although we've seen a slight shift under the reforms driven by the Department of Higher Education and Training, vocational schools and vocational training still has a low profile in terms of the education system in South Africa, but also the quality and the readiness of the education in terms of preparing young people for the workplace has always been a challenge. Fortunately, there have been some policy changes recently, such as the free education, which should open up doors and provide more education to more poorer students, allowing them to transition perhaps out of poverty. But there's still some gaps that exist in the labor market in terms of labor market inequalities between the skills that are demanded, primarily perhaps in services and financial sector, and where the economy needs to grow, which is around vocational skills as well as industrial capacity, because really this is what the country needs to revitalize in order to have sustainable growth moving forward.
You speak about the access that, of course, is created then within the higher education sector, but you're looking at the very least 4 years that would be required at least for a fresh crop of potential employees into the job market. Do you think that there are any more immediate interventions that can be put in place to ensure that the poor and the vulnerable in our society are perhaps better equipped to provide skills and to be empowered, because they continue to be the ones bearing the bulk of the burden of this inequality, and yet there seems to be no clear way of upskilling them to help them break out of the cycle?
Yes, I think in terms of the interventions that are in place, they're far and few in between. I think the government, and definitely private sector particularly, can do a lot more in terms of taking in younger skills and developing that skill. It's positive that, last week or the week before, the President inaugurated the Youth Employment Service, which will start creating opportunities for young people. But I think the challenge in South Africa cannot just be resolved through employment. I think what we need to develop is a young class of entrepreneurs, but in a situation where you have such low incomes and high inequality, people don't have the kind of safety net that you need in order to experiment with business and entrepreneurship. And so it becomes a catch-22. What I think needs to happen is that we need to promote more youth entrepreneurship, but also integrating them into the large corporate and existing value chains in order to give them the practice that they need to be successful at business on their own. I think just looking at the employment opportunities and the education system is a start, and it's a positive start, but we need to encourage and enable entrepreneurship in order to create more jobs, because that's the only way forward.
One of the other things that's highlighted in the report is the issue of spatial planning and the fact that there doesn't seem to be clear integration between the economic hubs, as it were, and your informal settlements and perhaps your even more rural areas. Do you think that that is an avenue that could be one of opportunity for government to look at, and including the private sector, of course?
Definitely. I think the working class, through multiple outlets of the struggle, have always continued to say, let's start building factories in townships as opposed to just constructing malls. This is what we're talking about, and this is also as a result of the apartheid legacy, which put people in sort of these labor enclaves and townships, etc., which are far from the urban centers where people do find jobs. And I think this is discouraging for young people who are unemployed, because before you can actually muster the confidence to go look for a job, you need to get transport monies, etc. And already the working class black South Africans spend quite a considerable amount on transport alone. I think estimates range between 40 to 2/3 of income just on transportation alone. And so the spatial legacy can only be undone by moving where we invest in the real estate, by bringing opportunities closer to where young black people are, but also by revitalizing what in Gauteng has been termed the township economies, in order to create a space where there's agglomeration, where informal small township business can benefit from being closer to big existing formal businesses. And I think this is one of the things that business sector and private sector in South Africa certainly has not been looking at, and it's been continuously overlooked, because I think the primary focus has been on creating employment or in reducing unemployment.
All right, Biniza from PESA, thank you for joining us on Newsnight tonight.